This is how the world could have looked like if the Axis secured a total victory over their enemies in the Second World War, landing in the United States of America and Britain, with not a lot of free and non-aligned nations remaining in the world. In the first episode of the Victory of Evil series, I explored how the Axis could achieve this victory, sacrificing a lot of realism in the process, but you don't need to watch it to understand this video, as here I would explore in detail what the world would actually look like in case of an Axis victory. For example, what the Reichskommissariats would look like, ultranationalist Britain, France, and in general what Germany would do next after they have already won the war, with them invading Italy being a strong possibility. I would also touch on some social aspects that I find really interesting, like the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup, which would take place in this new world order. Let me show you what I think the universe could have looked like, exploring most countries in detail. I think it's fair to start with Germany and their Reichskommissariats, then moving to Italy, their colonies and puppet states, then the other Axis minors, then Japan, the remnants of the Soviet Union and the remnants of the Allies, finishing up on South America, which would actually see a few changes this time. Now regarding Germany, this victory in the Second World War would only bolster the popularity of the ultranationalist regime, with their leaders and generals being seen as gods for achieving this victory against all odds and fulfilling their goal of unifying the German speakers. Now Germany has formed a lot of Reichskommissariat in the east and the west, which are basically German colonies in Europe, on paper not being part of Germany, but in all practice being ruled by a German minority, loyal to the ultranationalist party and ideology. The eventual goal of Germany was to annex all of these Reichskommissariats, once they're Germanized enough. Under General Plan Ost, which is the most disgusting thing I have ever read, this Germanization would be achieved in mainly two ways. The first way, as you would expect from the ultranationalists, to eliminate the local population and migrate Germans to the region. This was the plan for the all former Soviet lands. To the west, which is Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway, different efforts would be implemented as to Germanize the people and integrate them into the Reich. Mainly, native women would be forced to marry German citizens and reproduce, which over several generations would Germanize the entire population of the Western Reichskommissariats, and preventing native men from reproducing. Only then would these territories be integrated. Notably, these efforts would also be done in the east as well, but no mass killings of people were planned in the Western Reichskommissariats, apart from the Jews, so Germany would take two different approaches as to assimilate said people. What this means for Germany proper is that they would need a lot of people to go abroad and Germanize, so the ultranationalists would make several propaganda campaigns and indoctrinate the youth that the female's duty to the Reich is to have as many babies as possible, while men are expected to serve in the army and defend the Reich. Needless to say that this state would have total control over everything, education, press, culture, the list goes on, total control. I know that my audience is quite smart people, and there are plenty of things that I cannot say on YouTube, but as you already know, 1984 was written by George Orwell, and this was inspired by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, which is ultranationalist Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. The state would have total control over the minds of the people, as such anybody who speaks against it would disappear one way or the other. There would be fear for some and riches for others who obey the new system. I said there would be riches for some, as Germany would incentivize going abroad and Germanizing lands for the Reich, as the native population there would be eliminated one way or the other. The German citizens would reclaim their houses and possessions, further allowing them to have more children who would later do the same. I want to introduce characters to this story, as to make sense of what the everyday people would do, their struggles, worries, and general life under the new regime. This is Werner Kosch, a native German from Dresden who, after completing his mandatory military training, would be presented with an opportunity to move to Warsaw and aid the Reich in their Germanization efforts. Werner didn't serve in the Second World War, as he was only 17 years old, with the Germans in alternate history not lacking any soldiers, unlike historically, there is no need for people like Werner to be mobilized. As Werner would be 17 years old, and the year being 1946, Werner wouldn't remember the time before the ultranationalists took over in 1933, as he was only 4 years old. Werner would grow up being taught ultranationalist propaganda all his life basically. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda would look similar to the 1984's Ministry of Truth, where history would be rewritten in such a way as to justify the German conquests and glorify the Reich. History would be altered beyond recognition and changed multiple times as to fit the ever-changing narrative of the ultranationalist regime. Werner would arrive in Warsaw and marry a native Polish woman called Nadia, who would be 16 years old and lose her parents during the German occupation of the general government, never knowing what truly happened to them. Nadia's brother Peter also went missing in late 1939. He was a Polish soldier fighting against the Germans. She assumed that he was dead. Little did he know that Peter was actually alive and well, part of the Polish underground resistance, which strictly banned communication with the outside world and relatives, as to hide in secret. Peter was only 19 years old when he joined the army in 1939, and now he is 26 years old, being a resistance fighter and dreaming for a free Poland. In Germany and the Reichskommissariats, there would be a lot of brainwashing to the scale never seen before, and the sad part is that it would actually work. Native Germans wouldn't know any better and submit to the regime, or risk them and their entire families to perish, so it is these people that would carry out most of the atrocities, as the ultranationalist regime would make sure to dehumanize the Slavs and the Jews. To the Western Reichskommissariats, so integration efforts would follow as I outlined earlier, but what is truly horrifying is to the east, the former Soviet Union's lands. Under General Plan Ost, the plan supposed to take 25 years, so until 1971, starting in 1946, where, and I wish this was an exaggeration, but about 150 million people would disappear from Eastern Europe, being replaced with Germans. As for how this could happen, I cannot mention much, but for starvation under the Hergen Plan, abduction and Germanization of children, slave labor and deportations behind the Urals and the usual ultranationalist practices would be unfortunately very common to the east. As if this couldn't get any worse for these people, these plans would be carried out by the SS and Heinrich Himmler. Again, I cannot say much, but you can simply imagine the worst could happen. Eliminating close to 150 million people would obviously be very costly, and some estimates said that it would be about 60 billion Reichsmarks, which is close to the entire GDP of Germany for 1941. It's safe to say that these sinister plans would be very costly and very much time consuming. So what does this actually look like? Well, let us look at Reichskommissariat Ostland first, comprising of these territories, including not only the Baltic states, but also Ingria, Pskov and the Novgorod regions, with also the entirety of Belarus. The pre-war population of this region is approximately 16 million people, and here you can see a graph of all the nationalities which inhabited it before 1941. In Reichskommissariat Ostland, 50% of the Estonians and Latvians would cease to exist one way or the other, with 85% of Lithuanians following the same fate, and 100% of the Latgalians, who today have a total population of 150 titles and are based in Latvia. As for the Slavic portions, again, I wish this was a joke, but it was planned that in total Germany would remove 70 to 80 million Russians and 75% of Belarusians, one way or the other. As you can see, the Slavs make up about 11 million of the total Ostland population, and by some estimates 80 to 90% of them would no longer inhabit these lands. It was planned for Reichskommissariat Ostland to be settled by about 5 million Germans, with 2 million Lithuanians, Estonians and Latvians remaining combined. And the Slavs that would remain would be around 1.5 million people, which would be further marginalized and discriminated against. This gives Reichskommissariat Ostland a population of 8.5 million people if the plan is executed as it was proposed, and assuming that there are no big changes, but we can't ever know, so I would go with the official General Plan Ost estimates. The pre-war population was 16 million people if you remember, so about 70% of everyone living there would disappear as to make space for 5 million German settlers. As you can see, not all of the minorities would be eliminated, with some having a few percentage points estimated to survive, but these would be mostly children who would be re-educated and Germanized, and then forced into slave labor, so practically the entire adult population of these nationalities would be eliminated, and the Reich doesn't want them to reproduce and cause any problems. The capital of Reichskommissariat Ostland would be Riga, which is going to be over 80% German, and the Baltic states are likely going to be somewhat peaceful like they were historically. But in Belarus is where the true resistance would be, as the region became one of the bloodiest in the entire Second World War, due to German reprisals for the resistance fighters and villages that had nothing to do with it. The country would be ruled by Heinrich Wosch, a loyal ultranationalist carrying out the orders of the party. The territory of Ostland would be about of the same size of Ukraine and Belarus combined in the modern day, so about 800,000 square kilometers, and with 8.5 million inhabitants, it would have the same population density as Bolivia today, almost half of which is a desert or jungles, so there would be 10.6 people per square kilometer, most of which land would be owned by Germans, who would continue to dominate Ostland. In this alternate world, as to prior decolonization and ignoring the smaller Soviet breakaway states, Ostland would literally be the fourth least dense populated country in the world, after Mongolia, Australia and the democratic US-Canadian state. Alfred Rosenberg was responsible for drafting the plans for Ostland, and I kid you not, he had an idea of making Ostland a natural reserve, where everyone there would be eliminated or deported, so you can see just how sparsely populated Ostland would actually be, if the idea of making it a nature reserve was actually floated around. Looking at the population, the Germans in Ostland would eventually have a majority, which efforts would also be mirrored in the general government of Poland and Reichskommissariat Ukraine, with Caucasian, Rusland and Turkestan at the beginning having a strong German minority, who would be placed in charge and administer these lands. As I just said, the general government of Poland and Reichskommissariat Ukraine would see a very similar fate as Ostland. So I would quickly give you more information as to what these new states would actually look like, including their demographic shift. In the general government of Poland, 80 to 85% of the Poles were to be eliminated one way or the other, again with the children being spared, but they would be Germanized, much like Nadia for our own story, so basically all Poles would be in danger of ceasing to exist. As the Polish population in the general government was close to 12 million people, this would mean that about 1 million Poles would be spared. The city of Warsaw was planned to be literally destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up, being called New Deutsche Stadt Warschau. It was planned for between 2 and 2.5 million Germans to settle in the general government of Poland, so the total population would be around 3.2 million people, nearly 70% of them being Germans that just settled in the region, like Werner Koch of our own story, who would marry Polish women like Nadia and make German children, so the Poles remaining in the general government would have been gradually replaced. The population of the general government would go from 12 million people to before the war to 3.2 million people in the following decades, and this region would be about the same size as Bulgaria, which is about 150,000 square kilometers, resulting in a population density similar to that of Algeria, which is 21 people per square kilometer. For comparison, Poland today has 126 people per square kilometer, so this alternate general government of Poland would literally be 10 times more sparsely populated than Poland today, even when you count in the major German migration to the region. This is truly terrible, and in the coming decades it's likely that the general government is annexed into the Reich, but not just yet. Now regarding Reichskommissariat Ukraine, it would follow a similar fate, so I wouldn't go in detail too much. There were about 47 million people living in this region as to before the war, and the Germans would eliminate 50 to 70% of the Slavic people, leaving us with 18.8 million Slavs. The Germans would never achieve a majority in the state, unlike Ostland and the general government, so their plans were to create a smaller ruling German minority, with about 5 million Germans settling and taking up administrative tasks. Ukraine would be turned into the main food producer of the Reich, in other words, it would become a racial colony. Under General Plan Ost in 1971, the population of Ukraine would be near 20 million people, 25% of which would be Germans. I would speedrun telling you about Muscovian, Caucasian and Turkestan, as they would follow the same path as Ukraine, being racial colonies, with the German minority owning most of the farmlands and businesses. Muscovian would see their population, almost all of which were Russians, reduced from 46 million people to 12 million, with 5 million Germans overseeing the region and settling in the Moscow-Smolensk corridor and the Volga River. Neo-Moscow would become the nation's new capital. Again, like Warsaw, it would be rebuilt from the ground up. Now, for Reichskommissariat Caucasian, interestingly, Turkey would gain the Caucasus region, which the Germans would approve of, yet in their original plans they didn't account for this. What I find really interesting is that the Germans didn't want to settle Caucasian too much, unlike other Reichskommissariats. The Germans saw some of the people living there as semi-Aryan, and the Germans would mostly focus on building military bases in the region, in addition to extracting oil and other resources. The post-war population of the region was about 11 million people, and it was planned to reduce it to 7 million, with 500,000 or even a million Germans settling in the region, which is less than other Reichskommissariats. Caucasian would be established as a strategic colony, rather than a Lebensraum heartland, so Germany may not annex it eventually, but it would keep control over it for strategic and resource gains. Finally, I want to mention Reichskommissariat Turkestan, also known as the Muhammad Reich, where resources like oil, gas, cotton, agriculture, metals and rare earths are to be exported and go to the German Reich. As the Germans are already overstretched, they wouldn't colonize Turkestan. At a maximum 100,000 to 250,000 German settlers would go to the region. The total population was planned to drop from 25 million people to 15 million, with the Slavs in the region ceasing to exist. The Mohammed Reich is different from the other Reichskommissariats, as it's further away from the German heartland, so similarly to Caucasian, it's not going to be part of Lebensraum, and even further, it would be a German protectorate, having a lot more autonomy than other countries, so I would change their color to reflect this. Basically, there would be self-rule under German overlordship. So this is how all the Reichskommissariats would look like, with most losing at least half of their pre-war population, in addition to being settled by millions of Germans, which is a scary prospect, and I definitely shivered down my spine a few times while researching and writing this. What I must say is that all of what I just said wouldn't happen right away, as General Plan Ost was supposed to take 25 years. So if all goes according to plan, what I outlined would be finished by 1971, but I assure you that it wouldn't go all according to plan. Still, I would like to explain the dynamics later, but this is all you need to know for now. Most of the Reichskommissariats would be settled by Germans, and about 150 million people would cease to exist in the Soviet lands. Now, not all of them would be killed via the hunger plan, nor the concentration camps, but tens of millions of Slavs were planned to be deported beyond the Urals, 50 to 60 million people to be exact, which would change the dynamics in the Russian warlord states, that I would explore later. Further, when it says that Germany would settle these lands, it doesn't exactly mean the Germans from the Reich. It could also be loyal Germanized Latvians and even Czechs that would settle alongside the Germans, as well as some Volga Germans and Germans in Eastern Europe that would also settle these regions and gain privileges similarly to the native German counterparts. While we're on the topic of the Czechs, I think that Protectorate Bohemian and Moravian would be formally annexed into Germany proper. It was established with nominal autonomy as the Austrian painter wanted to appease the Czech population living there. So now that the war is over, the Germans can seize these lands officially and there is no need to pretend like this region is some sort of independent country. I want to give you another detail that is rarely mentioned and I think that it makes sense. As I just described, these Reichskommissariats would lose more than half of their populations, and of course there would be plenty of partisans fighting against the new status quo. Reichskommissariats, like Ostland, would be very sparsely populated, as even Saudi Arabia today is on average more densely populated than what would be Ostland. As such, the Germans would need to build a lot of infrastructure to connect these cities and villages, via railroads and highways. This way, no settlements in set Reichskommissariats would be very isolated and become a hub for resistance, allowing the Germans to reach them quite easily if need be. The German Reich would build up a lot of infrastructure purely for the reason of furthering their control, and this infrastructure is likely going to be way too costly, as we're talking about mega projects that would connect many inhabited places that the Germans themselves in 1941 didn't have. The Reich is going to have to build railways and motorways like crazy. So the original 60 billion Reichsmarks to complete General Plan Ost, which I must remind you was equivalent to the entire German GDP in 1941, which was at the peak of their power, would be overshot several times. So General Plan Ost would become too costly way too quickly. Unfortunately, it may become more cost effective to wipe out entire villages and settlements off the map, rather than to build infrastructure to them, and I think that the Germans would want to do that to their Eastern Reichskommissariats as to ease cost. Now I did achieve a total Axis victory scenario, so they have parts of the United States and Canada, in addition to some Caribbean and South American colonies, but also in Africa. For now, the German America would immediately change for the worst. I can assume that some prominent companies would take over and form an oligarchic society, as some American businessmen admired the Austrian painter, and this victory brought to them cheap labor and total control. Iconic symbols of American identity would be destroyed, such as the Statue of Liberty, and it could be replaced by a pro-ultranationalist statue in the future. Similar fate of destroying the history and the heritage of these new states would continue on with other landmarks, which are slowly going to be replaced. For the South, considering that they have the Confederates flag, I assume that you know what exactly would happen there, and I don't have to mention it out loud. Generally, some Germans would settle both German puppet states in the Americas, but there weren't planned any mass killings and so on. Yet in the south, we can assume that some people would be enslaved, purging the region back to the situation it was in before 1861. YouTube wouldn't like me if I was too specific, so I'm keeping it all vague, but I'm sure you know what exactly would happen. Finally, regarding the German sphere, there is the African colonies. To put it simply, it's your ordinary colonial government, which would seize resources and mistreat the natives, following in European settlers. So far I have told you how the German Reich would operate and what their goals would be, which is very gruesome to say the least. So let me give you something slightly more positive, or at least more interesting than hundreds of millions of people dying. The Germans can host the Olympic Games once again, which they last hosted in Berlin in 1936, but were paused during the Second World War. Now the Olympic Games can continue, as well as the Football World Cup. So which nations would participate? Well, it's easier for me to tell you which ones wouldn't participate, and this is the Axis puppet states. Now let's think about it logically. Why would Germany allow Reichskommissariat Ukraine and Moscovian to participate on their own? They are likely going to be represented purely by the Germans either way, as the Slavs are gone or aren't allowed to represent their region, so it's going to be Germans against Germans. What I see more likely is that Germany and literally all of their Reichskommissariats participate as a single nation, both in the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup. This trend would also continue to Asia, where Japan and Taiwan would participate on their own, but their Chinese and Mongolian puppet states, for example, wouldn't be allowed to join. Further, the remnants of the Allies, which is the USA and Canada, in addition to India, Australia and New Zealand, would be banned from participating. The African colonies aren't independent countries, and due to the racial policies of the Reich, they are also not allowed to participate regardless. I think that South America would be allowed to participate just fine, in addition to Turkey, Iraq and maybe Saudi Arabia. The latter of two would be too insignificant either ways. Italy has their own puppet states over Montenegro and Greece, and the Italians wouldn't allow these nations to participate on their own, fly a separate banner and have any sort of a national identity, so some of these nations would participate under the banner and ideology of the protector nation, which is Italy. Serbia is a weird one, and I cannot see them participating, as in the post-war world I can see them being partitioned by Hungary, which would gain West Banat, Bulgaria, which would gain the Niš province, east of the Morava river, Italy would gain more of Kosovo, and Croatia would gain the rest. In this alternate history, Serbia would be by all means a defeated nation, and the ultranationalist ideology stated that Europe should have 4 or 5 strong nations dominating the continent, so there is no place for smaller, weaker countries. Now I would allow Serbia to exist and not be partitioned, and later I would explore their situation in detail, which would be way more gruesome than you may think. Here is another interesting fact regarding the Axis and football games. The national teams of the Axis members frequently played against each other during the Second World War, but after the disaster at Stalingrad they stopped these friendly matches. These games had tens of thousands of people watching them live on stadiums, and as Germany was on the decline, this could put a large target on said stadiums. What I'm trying to say is that football would be even more popular in this new world order. Games would be played out more frequently, and there would be greater prizes, so hey, at least there is something positive in this scenario, and also the build-up of infrastructure in Eastern Europe, but said infrastructure is built for more sinister reasons. Now I mentioned Werner, Nadia and Peter. These characters would become more relevant as the story goes on. But to give you more detail, Nadia would be one of the few Polish people that would survive in Warsaw after the destruction and rebuilding of the city, with her being saved because she was still a child that could be brainwashed by the ultranationalists to be Germanized, and she was married to Werner Koch, a German national from Dresden, who would Germanize her and their children. Everything that Nadia knew would be destroyed, while Werner was indoctrinated into the ultranationalist propaganda at an early age, and he would be told that anybody who doesn't unconditionally support the Reich is seen as an enemy of the state, so the young couple would engage in conflicts, but this wouldn't stop them giving birth to their first child, which I would call Klaus. This concludes the German sphere, how these states would look like in the general life of the everyday people. Moving south from that, I would like to explore the Italian sphere, which I would also include Spain, Portugal and Turkey to join, as well as their colonies and Bulgaria, which is their traditional ally. First up, the mainland of Italy wouldn't change too drastically, as Mussolini was opposed to many of the racial policies of the ultranationalist Germans. Italian ultranationalism, as to oversimplify it heavily, was based in reverting their humiliation in the Great War and forming Greater Italy around the Mediterranean Sea. Still, there would be some racial policies in the Italian colonies. Africa Orientale Italiana would be turned into a racially segregated settler colony, which would receive millions of Italian settlers, especially in Eritrea. Libya and likely Tunisia are formally annexed into Italy, known as the Fourth Shore. They would become integral parts of Italy, not just colonies. The coastline would still be very much Italianized, as it was planned for 500,000 Italians to move there 5 years after winning the Second World War. Greece and Montenegro would be nominally independent, but be under tight Italian economic and military control. The thing is that the Greeks would alter these plans, with partisan warfare making it difficult for the Italians to consolidate full control, likely requiring Bulgarian and Turkish help. There would be forced assimilation of Slovenes and Croats, and even Frenchmen in the conquered territories in Corsica. These efforts would be quite difficult, especially as the Italians wouldn't apply such brutal methods as the Germans in the east, so Italy would slowly consolidate power and eternally fight rebels in the Balkans and Africa. One main goal of Italy, such as Germany, was to create a fully self-sufficient state, which the Italians could theoretically achieve, having enough manpower and raw resources. Interestingly, as Germany would be supplied with grain from Ukraine, Italy's plans included their food supplies coming from North Africa, notably Egypt, due to their fertile lands. Basically, the Italian sphere is much weaker than the German one, and the thing is that Italy would have a harder time consolidating power. Regardless, Spain, Portugal, Bulgaria and Turkey are much more willing to work with the Italians than the Germans, as they see the Reich as too extreme, even by ultranationalist standards, and fear that they would be next. Remember that the Austrian painter didn't exactly like the Mediterranean people, and with their racial theory they were placed well under some people like Georgians and Armenians, so the southern European nations may fear a future German invasion, and them fearing the worst could stand strong against the Germans, so there would be a lot of internal division in the Axis. Germany invading Italy is a possibility, as to get South Tyrol, which was German inhabited, and the Eastern Peninsula, formerly part of the Holy Roman Empire, getting the Reich access to the Mediterranean Sea. The thing is that the Pact of Steel between Italy and Germany was signed in 1939 and it would expire 10 years later, so in 1949. Germany is surely not going to break this pact, right? I mean, when they have ever disobeyed a treaty. I would explore future German-Italian relations in the following episodes, and the potential split between the two factions, with war between the two being definitely on the table. Regarding the other Italian allies, Spain and Portugal wouldn't change too much, as historically they continued to be sort of ultranationalist even after the Second World War ended. So we already know what these states would look like. Still, these states made compromises with the West as to appease them. So in this timeline, these compromises would be in favor of Germany and Italy, rather than the West. Turkey, Bulgaria and Croatia is where the real changes would come. First up, Croatia is going to be extremely unstable after the war. The Ustaše wanted to deport 1/3 of the Serbians, to kill 1/3 of them and to assimilate 1/3. As such, they are likely going to want some sort of a Serbian state, to which they can deport millions of Serbs within their lands. I would guess that if Serbia is annexed and partitioned between their neighbors, it would be worse for all countries involved, except Italy. So Serbia in this timeline is going to remain somewhat free, but unstable and radical. The Croatians would fear the Italian claims on their lands, so Croatia may turn to Germany for protection, complicating relations between Germany and Italy. On the other hand, the Germans disliked the Slavs and were committing unspeakable crimes against them in the Eastern Europe, so Croatia may be more wary of becoming too chummy with the Germans. For similar reasons, Bulgaria would be horrified. They joined the Axis only because they did not want to be invaded and weren't ideologically committed to the Axis New World Order, and Turkey would be in a similar position in its alternate history. Bulgaria, however, I think would be pretty bad after the war, as Boris III would be dead, and his heir Simeon II would only be 9 years old, so he wouldn't be able to take the throne directly. Instead, the ultranationalist leaders would form a royal dictatorship and sway a regency council, so they may attempt to turn Simeon II to more ultranationalist ideas and use him as a puppet leader. Turkey, on the other hand, would consolidate their gains and may turn to the past for the Ottoman Empire, initiating ethnic cleansing and making sure that no minority has a majority in any province, so all are going to be either resettled or straight up eliminated. Still, while the Turks have the Caucasus, they would provide the Germans with much needed oil, so they don't have total control and they are still dependent on Germany and would be fearful to ally closely with Italy. Still, I would say that Turkey would balance out the ultranationalist giants and change their allegiance when it best suits them. Romania, which I can see allying with the Italian faction, which could be hard considering the German influence there and their need for oil, would become a brutal dictatorship, consolidating the Ukrainian lands that they got, but still wishing to regain northern Transylvania. This version of Romania I think would be worse off than the communist Romania in our own history, and this version of Romania was already very poor and unstable, so it would take some time for Romania to achieve any sort of stability. Hungary is an interesting case. They may be in the German sphere of influence out of necessity, but see the Germans as way too extreme and Hungary might want to break free, preferring to work with the more moderate Italians. The thing is that there were some Germans in Hungary, so I can see the ultranationalist Germans to cool the country, putting the Arrow Cross party in charge, much like how they did in 1944. I can see Hungary becoming the most unstable country on the list, due to them unwillingly becoming a German puppet state, once again being under the boot of a German country. This is how I would divide the Italian and German spheres of influence after the war, but this is also another way to divide this, so who's to say? For the sake of this series, I would go with the first option, as it makes it way more balanced and more interesting. Japan always envisioned a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, where the member states would trade with each other, giving the bloc economic self-sufficiency. This was the official statement, in addition to liberating Asia from Western imperialism, but the official statement of Germany as to invade the Soviet Union was to liberate the people. And as you know, what I described earlier was far from a liberation. In all actuality, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would promote Japanese superiority, with all member states giving up their autonomy and becoming Japanese puppets. The plan by Japan was actually very sinister, as Japan would basically monopolize the industry, not allowing other members to be too industrialized, with the other members being suppliers of raw materials and cheap labor. To put it simply, Japan would control the industry and make the weapons, so their subjects cannot even produce something worthwhile as to challenge the Japanese rule. Much like Germany building up Eastern Europe in this alternate world, Japan would do the same but for similar reasons, which is not to help the people, but rather to facilitate military control and extract resources faster and cheaper. Japan itself is a country that notoriously lacked a lot of resources, but are industrially capable. If all goes to plan, Japan would be very well off, but you can perhaps see the problem. Japan is basically kept afloat by their subjects, as if said subjects were to coordinate, they could overthrow the Japanese, as Japan doesn't have the raw resources to continue the fight. This creates the dynamic of the Japanese being more dependent on their subjects than vice versa. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be good news, as the Japanese would know their dominance, and as such they would brutally eliminate people who hold or spread anti-Japanese sentiment. The sad part is that this would go unrestricted, as Japan could become really paranoid about a future uprising, so they would kill perhaps millions of innocent people in the process of making their subjects ideologically pure. This is the situation in the home islands, basically one of paranoia and extermination of other people who don't fit the regime's narrative. For the Koreans, they would start to get assimilated much quicker than historically, and more brutal methods could be used as nobody would stop Japan, so the Eastern realm isn't looking too great, I would have to admit. China would be ruled by Wang Jingwei's government, and it came to be after Wang Jingwei, a rival of Chiang Kai-shek, a member of the pro-peace faction of the Kuomintang, defected to the Japanese and formed this puppet government, claiming all of China, with the exception of the Japanese puppet states and possessions. As you can see, they clearly don't control all of China, as Japan has annexed some territories and formed a puppet government around it. Regarding the annexed Japanese territories, they are likely to be returned to China, with the south being retained for a bit longer. The reason why Japan would keep them for now is because it gives them leverage over China, and they would return these lands only when the Chinese are committed to submitting themselves to Japan, Japanese imperialism and the ultranationalist ideology. China under Wang Jingwei's government was a brutal dictatorship, yet before 1943 they didn't have too much autonomy, and only consolidated control over the conquered territories. Only after 1943 did they start to have more sovereignty, but power was still held by the Japanese military. Wang had a little to no autonomy in major decisions. Most notably, later in the war, they were allowed to have an army, where they boasted between 300,000 and 500,000 troops, though poorly trained and equipped. In a case of Japanese victory, I would assume that the Chinese army would be gradually limited, and flow of information of military strategies and doctrines is also going to be restricted. So with that story out of the way, what does China actually look like under Japan? Well, I would be honest, it would be really bad. Wang Jingwei died in 1944, and he was the one who formed and stabilized the Chinese puppet regime. Further, the general Chinese public never supported the regime, so it's going to be quite unpopular, and for Japan, killing hundreds of millions of people is also not an option. As such, China is going to get fragmented, with the Japanese using the strategy of divide and conquer. I would create a North China Autonomous Region, centered in Beijing, East and Central China centered in Nanjing, Shanghai and Wuhan, with the coastal areas basically being under direct Japanese control. Southwest China centered in Guangxi, Yunnan and Sichuan would be broken up into several smaller states, and this area was originally the stronghold of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, so these people are way less likely to cooperate. There would be no unified China, and rather a divide and rule system, with the before-mentioned infrastructure projects modernizing the region. But of course this is not the idea for the Chinese to benefit, but rather to move goods easily to Japan. Generally, balancing the power between Puji and the Chinese puppet states would be very difficult, and it's anybody's guess what could have happened next. In my opinion, Manchukuo would slowly annex some border territories over time. As you can see from the map, there is also Tibet and Northwest China that are in the Japanese sphere, but they are likely to be tributary states, being part of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but real Japanese control there is quite weak. This settles most of China, and I haven't mentioned Manchukuo, but I would be real, I don't think anything drastic would change there. They were already a loyal Japanese puppet. I could see them expanding into Mongolia and even outer Manchuria, and I would allow it for this scenario. As for the other Japanese puppets and members of the faction of economic exploitation, the Far Eastern Republic isn't too interesting to mention. Russians are going to be deported. Japanese, loyal Koreans and Chinese were to migrate there and enforce their rule, which I think would happen rather easily, as the region was very sparsely underpopulated. It being annexed into Japan would be inevitable in a decade from now. Indonesia would become the crown jewel of Japan, as the country would transform a lot, from being a Dutch colony to being one of Japan, but with the pretext that they are liberated. Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta are likely going to have nominal control and act as figureheads, but still the Japanese military will control all the important choices. This is quite a contrast from how Germany would rule their Reichskommissariats, as there the Germans wouldn't give any local autonomy, while the Japanese would to some extent. Indonesia, with their rich resources, is going to be the most important possession of the Japanese, and they would like to keep it this way, so the Japanese are going to go out of their way to ensure that any anti-Japanese resistance is crushed early on. This would include communist rebels, former Dutch loyalists or Islamic movements, which the Japanese would like to crush. Islamic movements are also going to be suppressed in Bangladesh and West China, by the way. A full Indonesian rebellion might be inevitable in the decades after, as anti-colonial sentiment would only continue to grow, but as I said, instead of the Dutch colonizers, it was now the Japanese ones. Indonesia is one of the most important subjects of Japan, while also being the most disloyal and rebellious. In the next episode, I would explore how this dynamic would play out. Vietnam is also an important colony of Japan, but they would like to have more autonomy than the rest, under Bao Dai or a similar figure. The problem is that Ho Chi Minh would likely be active and fight a costly guerrilla war, trying to free Vietnam from Japanese rule. On the other hand, with the Soviet Union no longer existing, these communist movements may be less popular, but there are guaranteed to be some calls for total independence, especially in the north of the country, where the mountains and the countryside would prove to be useful for the rebels. As a result of that, I wouldn't be surprised if Japanese control weakens over Vietnam in the coming decades, so they, just like Indonesia, are in a position to challenge the Japanese New World Order in East Asia. The Philippines is likely going to be led by Jose P. Lauro, who was the president of the Second Philippine Republic, which could of course be a Japanese puppet state as well. Japan, as to keep control over the Philippines, would disproportionately have more Japanese advisors in the Philippine government, or the Japanese would have more seats in parliament, so they would have a lot of control over the nation. Now, what I find interesting is that English was one of the official languages of the Philippines, which, considering the Japanese anti-Western stances, could mean that millions of people would be forced to learn Japanese, and there would be discriminations against English speakers. As such, I can see rebellions constantly happening in the Philippines, with the Hukbawahap movement gaining traction, although similarly to Ho Chi Minh, it's impossible to know how these communist movements would fare, and if they would be still very popular. At the very least, Catholics would organize resistance to the north, while Muslims to the south. Taiwan, despite being an independent country at the start of the war, after a Japanese victory, it would most likely be transformed into a Japanese client state, but not a full colony. The Thai nation is going to operate as normal, but allow Japan to take key decisions in regarding to their foreign policy, military and economy. Field Marshal Puek Phibonsok Karam is likely going to remain in charge of the nation. A notable difference between Thailand and other countries in the region is that Thailand may be allowed to industrialize, while, let me remind you, basically all the rest of the Japanese client states would be banned from industrializing without the approval of Tokyo first, and they would focus on giving resources to the Japanese industries, rather than developing their own. Taiwan would be different, and with more industrialization, they would become a dominant power in the region, which, although for the time being loyal to Japan, all could change later. As you can see, the Japanese faction is basically a house of cards. If one country falls to a rebellion or declares independence, literally all of the rest would follow. So Japan, knowing this and as a result of that, would apply brutal methods, such as the Germans in Eastern Europe, as to keep all of their subjects loyal and prevent the domino effect in Asia. India and Pakistan are also going to be a Japanese fear in my series. Pakistan is the most simple country to cover. They are simply an economic protectorate of Japan. The Japanese wouldn't have a lot of influence over the nation, but they would protect them from the remnants of India and sign trade deals with the country. As for Japanese India, which would occupy Bangladesh and parts of Burma, it would be called Azad Hind, and it would be led by Subhas Chandra Bose, who already collaborated with the Japanese in our own history. The capital of the nation is likely going to be in Calcutta. The country would be sort of independent and loyal to Japan, relying on them for protection, but it would be far from a free country and would most likely become a dictatorship under Subhas Chandra Bose. As you can see, this new state would be about half Hindu and half Muslim, so maintaining the balance between the two would be rather difficult. Japan also wanted part of southern India and Sri Lanka, which would follow a similar path to Azad Hind, although I can see Sri Lanka being more into the Japanese sphere, being an extension of the Japanese mainland. What is important is that the Indian subjects are likely going to be more loyal, wishing to reclaim the rest of India, and as such the Indian National Army would be allowed to have some more autonomy and have no army restrictions, so India would be the peacekeepers on behalf of Japan in the region. What you can see from this is that Japan, much like Italy, is much more reliant on their subjects, and they would hold way less direct control over them, unlike Germany. Basically, Italy would rely on Egypt and Libya for their food supply, while Japan would rely on Indonesia and Vietnam for food and raw materials, which are also the two countries in the Japanese sphere that are the most likely to break away or declare independence. Japan and Italy are basically at the mercy of their colonies, so for their long-term success I am more so pessimistic. Going back to Europe, Britain would be called Gross-Britannian, and I think that they would be ruled by Oswald Mosley, who was suggested to become the head of government, and was considered by ultranationalist Germany as the ideal candidate to rule a pro-Axis British government. I have no idea what would happen to the monarchy. Perhaps Edward VIII remains in power and continues to work with the regime, while some parts of the royal family flee and escape to Canada and the United States of America. There is likely going to be a House of Windsor split, but to what extent I cannot really say. For the sake of this series, Edward VIII would remain in Britain and be a figurehead of the country, stabilizing and legitimizing the new regime by Oswald Mosley. The British Navy is likely going to be absorbed into the Kriegsmarine, and Britain as a result of that would be neutralized as a threat. While it would become somewhat independent, not being direct German Reichskommissariat, they are also very dependent on Germany and would provide them with cheap resources. Politically, the British ultranationalists would pursue a policy of assimilation of the Scots and Welsh, which was also done for centuries before this, but now it would start to intensify. For example, in Wales there was a sign made for students who spoke Welsh, their mother tongue, in Welsh schools. This sign was intended to be worn by these people who committed the crime of speaking their own language, and it was supposed to shame them. All of this was happening in the 18th century to the start of the 20th century, so now these policies of assimilation aren't new to Britain, but they would be more radical and intensify greatly. There is going to be resistance for sure, with Scotland being deeply against this and starting a resistance movement. Further, the British are going to start to get Germanized over time, similarly to the Western Reichskommissariats. German men would marry English women and produce loyal German children, changing the demographics of Britain in a few generations. In this alternate history during the war, a rumor would be floated around that if the British citizens hand over their children under the age of 13 to the Germans for re-education purposes, that the entire population of Britain would be spared. In an event that would later become known as the Silent Winter, exactly this would happen, as the parents would believe that this is only temporarily, but in fact none of them would ever see their children ever again. As such, to cope with their collective remorse, the British would be given state-distributed drugs, which suppresses unhappy memories and indicates a state of euphoria. The side effects would unfortunately include addiction, memory loss and susceptibility to manipulation. Now, I may have taken inspiration from a video game called We Happy Few, but the point still stands. I think that the ultranationalists would likely drug the entire population of their occupied territories. While propaganda was effective for brainwashing the German citizens, their subjects wouldn't be susceptible to it. As such, this is why I borrowed this idea of creating a drug that the people would be forced to use, artificially making them feel better, but also making them easier to manipulate. The drug would also be very addictive and have several side effects, so the British people would forget the past due to abusing this drug, while also being willing to do literally anything to get more of it. The state would distribute these drugs to everyone, under several conditions that make them nice servants, for example not to reproduce, challenge German authority and so on. Of course this wouldn't take place in all of Britain, but likely some major cities, with the countryside still being very much prone to resistance fighting. Britain is going to become a key partner of Germany, but never an equal one. I think that this is inevitable, that Germany starts working with Britain more and slowly abandons their relations with Italy, so the two sides of Europe would grow very differently and opposed to each other, escalating tensions in the following decades. France I previously put in the Italian sphere of influence, and I think that this makes sense, considering their historic hate for Germany, but also there is another reason. I think that Italy would start promoting the Catholic religion as part of their identity, while the Germans would start to actively suppress Christianity and more so Catholicism. France, which is a deeply Catholic nation and one that is historically opposed to Germany, would work with the Italians. Marshal Philippe Pétain would take full control over France and establish a dictatorship, which would be really unstable due to the German forces continuing to operate in France, still having direct control over important railroads and port cities. So France is dependent on Germany, and any wrong move could mean a German invasion. Parts of the French industry are also occupied by Germany along similar lines, so while France may have a lot of resources and industry on paper, most of them would be occupied by the Germans under the pretext of war reparations, but the real reason for this is that Germany wanted to cripple France. It is safe to say that France would be forced to economically and culturally decline under this new world order, dominated by Germany. The only hope for France to restore their previous glory would be to work with Italy, which trend would be similar into other countries in Europe, even Japan as well. Really quickly I want to go over the Russian states. The remnants of the Soviet Union would be in Omsk, and I will uncover all of these nations in detail. What is important to cover is the Ural republics, as Germany would initiate a mass deportation of 50 to 60 million Slavs beyond the Urals. These people would find themselves in the two Ural republics, which would lack the infrastructure and food to house so many people, resulting in a mass famine in the region. Life would be truly horrible in these states, and if it couldn't get any worse, these states would actively engage in wars among each other, vying for power and wanting to unite Russia under their leadership. To summarize, there is going to be a mass famine under a constant civil war. Sadly, these deported migrants are likely going to be mobilized in the army in exchange for food, and their lives would be lost in wars in the region, which is a horrible fate to have. Once one country unites most of the region, it would become more peaceful, and they could use the migrants to produce food and coordinate better against the Germans and Japanese, but for now these states are fully fighting each other. As for the American sphere, this is what is left over from Canada and the United States of America, which lands are too sparsely populated, and the Axis wouldn't conquer them completely. In this alternate history, the Americans most likely had the nuclear bomb ready, but lost the war a few months before the Manhattan Project was completed. The Germans are unlikely going to know about this detail, given the secrecy of the project. What I find really interesting is that Wyoming is still part of the Free America state, and it has some uranium mines, which could be used to finish and expand the Manhattan Project. The true power of the nuclear weapon isn't explored fully, as one was never used during the Second World War, but Free America would believe that this would aid them in reclaiming their homeland. Further, I can see many people migrating to this state after the German and Japanese occupations, and I can see the Axis to start deporting people there as well, which would find their way in Free America. In terms of land, this is quite a lot, but still the country is very underpopulated and suffer greatly initially from all the challenges I just mentioned. In terms of a president, it's obviously impossible to tell for sure, but Eisenhower and MacArthur are certainly an option. The problem is that both generals were stationed in the Philippines, and now with the Japanese winning in this front, these figures may be imprisoned, but who's to say exactly. I'd like to have a strong leader like one of the two men I just mentioned, seeking to reclaim what they lost and liberate the world from totalitarian ideologies. South America, although it would be more or less the same initially, likely due to the decisive Axis victory, would see more nations like Argentina and maybe Brazil turn to ultranationalism, which would mean that in the next episode there would be a lot of wars in the continent. Speaking of wars, Germany's economy is basically reliant on looting, stealing and exploiting conquered lands. Now the Germans have won the Second World War, and they would have to shift from a military economy to a civilian one, which considering the cost of General Plan Ost would really crush the German economy, and this would create for much more pressure around the world, and this topic I would like to explore in the next episode. Now, thank you for watching, check out the video on the screen and I hope to see you there. As always, I wish you all the best and goodbye.